Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to our discussion of Francis Bacon. We're in the middle of a discussion of the great British painter Francis Bacon, and last time we looked at how Bacon had come up from the underworld that he had sojourned in through 1946 down to about 1956 in his confrontation with the color palette of Van Gogh, and how his sort of discovery of this sort of rainbow-hued color palette of Van Gogh began to awaken in Bacon a new sense of color. So we get lots of color coming into his canvases at this time. Also at about this time, right around 1960 or so, Bacon begins to embark on a series of self-portraits. But long about the time he met George Dyer, who became his gay lover in 1964, until Dyer's suicide in 1971, Bacon stopped painting portraits of himself and started painting portraits of George Dyer. This is one of the first of them. This is 3 studies for a portrait of George Dyer from 1964. And in it we can see how he has plugged Dyer into his asignifying regime of defacialization. He'd been doing that with all of his friends at this time. This is 3 studies of Isabella Rawthorne from the same period. And now, whereas Bacon had discovered his own defacialization mask, his sort of own asignifying mask during his sojourn in the underworld between 46 and 56, where he had been dealing with these anonymous shades and phantoms of businessmen and various phantom-like individuals. They were all anonymous and unknown. Now he begins to defacialize and then refacialize his friends, actual full 3-dimensional individuals, onto the plane of his own signification, whereby this is something different from modernism. At first glance it looks similar to what Picasso was doing, but what Picasso was doing, his détraits, his defacializations, were essentially attempts to refacialize the portrait study onto the plane of modernist signification, which was an aperspectival one. And so when you're looking at a Picasso facial distortion, you're looking at a face from multiple points of view simultaneously. It might be a profile, it might be an emphase image simultaneously, so you get both points of view. So it has that semiotic to it. No such semiotic exists in the defacializations of Francis Bacon, which are asignifying masks. They don't mean anything. He's simply unplugging individuals from all regimes of signification, and in this sense, I see him as very firmly part of the contemporary art movement. He's also doing something that's topologically complex in contrast to what Warhol was doing across the water in New York at about the same time with his celebrity portraits, where Warhol was representing the celebrity's descent into electronic culture with 2-dimensional avatars. I think that the defacialized portraits of Bacon are sort of n-dimensional. They're multi-dimensional. They're very complex, and they can't be reduced to a single plane of signification. They're asignifying. As we see on this painting here, this is 2 studies for a portrait of George Dyer from 1968, in which we see basically, this is the closest thing to an aesthetic credo that we find in Bacon's work. Here we see George Dyer sitting as a model for a Francis Bacon painting of him in the background, in which Dyer is represented as a pure figure minus a ground on Bacon's own plane of signification, a canvas which stands in here for what would normally be his hermetic cube, his angular apparatus of capture, and we see that Dyer has been defacialized. It looks as though his head has been split open, and there are a series of nails attaching his form to the canvas, because essentially what he's done is to create a plane of asignifying signification. It's a plane without meaning, into which he is plugging the portraits of the people that he knows and rupturing them, turning them into topologically complex entities that are more complex than the merely 2-dimensional phantoms of the corporate ad logo world of the celebrity culture. But long about 1971, George Dyer dies from an overdose, and Bacon now has to deal with the death. And I think this is the second major event after the color event. This is the next major event that hits him and transforms his canvases from this point on. We see him wrestling with this in this canvas. This is 3 canvases, Triptych in Memory of George Dyer, 1971, in which Dyer here is represented as a shadow, a phantom, a shade, basically. And Dyer essentially was Bacon's shadow. He was Bacon's alter ego that was cast into the world of his canvases as Bacon's alter ego, essentially playing the role of the shadow. Here we see him reaching up to open up a door, undoubtedly the entrance to Bacon's underworld that he is now about to go back into as a shadow. This canvas here is our series of 3 canvases, is Triptych, May, June 1973, where we see Dyer's death represented. Dyer is vomiting into the sink on the right-hand panel, and on the left-hand panel he is dead on the toilet where he was found. The middle panel is interesting, though, because you'll note that the shadow that Dyer casts is not exactly a human shadow. It looks more like a demon. And indeed, I think that it represents now the reappearance of monsters in Bacon's art, where they have been essentially non-existent for about a decade. But with Dyer's death, monsters now begin to reappear in Bacon's canvases as avenging furies that are they function like pangs of conscience that trouble him, like the furies in Aeschylus's Oresteia that haunt Orestes after he murders his mother. Here is that phantom figure, the shadow, coming in now from the left, from a blue void that looks like it might be coming in from the sea, coming in from a blue void into Bacon's domestic interior, which is his primary stage setting, which now begins to open up for the first time. This is Triptych, May-June 1974, and now we can see that the interior for the first time has vanished. And now we're out as though on a seascape. We're at the beach here with the ocean in the background, and we've got 3 different panels representing George Dyer. So Dyer's death also impacts his semiotic cube with its hermetic interior, and it begins to disintegrate now as though Dyer's death crashed into it like a meteorite. And the monsters that begin to appear as the avenging furies begin to populate Bacon's canvases more and more often now. This is Figure in Movement from 1976, and we can see that same phantasmatic figure drifting in here from the left as though we're about to dismantle Bacon's hermetic cube. And here in this triptych, inspired by the Oresteia of Aeschylus of 1981, we can see the avenging fury on the left canvas here representing on the inside of that cube, where it is beginning now to dismantle and rupture it. And indeed, Bacon's interiors now begin to be engulfed and swallowed by a yawning black void. This is Triptych, August 1972, that begins to open up and begins to swallow it and to engulf it. Landscape 1978 is an image of the dissolution of Bacon's interior. He shifts to landscape paintings, and it's an apparently innocuous thing, but the fact is that Bacon's death was, or rather Dyer's death was troubling Bacon all along, and his interiors begin to disintegrate now and open up to the outer world. In this one, A Piece of Wasteland from 1982, the hermetic cube has vanished entirely. It's gone now, and Bacon's microcosm is no more. We can see in this canvas here Jet of Water from 1979, which Bacon later reworked as one of his last canvases in 1988. In this one, the jet of water is coming from the right, from the same direction that we saw the fury drifting in through the open window in the seated figure of 1974. It's coming in from the right, and it's spraying against his hermetic interior and beginning to wash it away in a flood. It's almost like the flood of Noah in miniature that begins to wash away his little microcosm. And what's left of it is pictured here in the sand dune of 1983, which looks like the kind of thing that one would expect to find after a civilization had cycled through its ruins and become buried and absorbed again by the blanket of nature, which simply covers it back up again, and now it has become only a memory. This is Bacon's last canvas, and it's one of his most enigmatic, Study for the Human Body of 1991, and it's as though now we were on the outside of his domestic interior looking in, as though we were given a privileged point of access, and we see now that it had been a stage setting for the whole time. It had just been a stage setting. Dyer is painted in such a way that he looks as though he has crashed into that interior. He's partially into it. So there's in a certain sense, it's a statement of the inextricability of Dyer from, as an icon, from the stage setting of Bacon's private interiors. But clearly those private interiors are now a thing of the past. They're revealed as merely a faux setting, and Bacon is moving on to the outside of them. And who knows, if he had lived longer, what other paintings he might have discovered beyond his stage setting, which he was clearly beginning to move away from in these last images. And so that's the evolution of the oeuvre of Francis Bacon. And I think we can see there's a heavy influence on Damien Hirst, which we will look at next. The hermetic cube becomes the vitrine, the glass, rectangular, and square-shaped vitrine of Damien Hirst's art. And there are a lot of motifs from Bacon that we will see turning up in the artwork of Damien Hirst, whom we'll look at next.